I want to welcome everyone to our very special event. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Azusa Pacific. And it's been really fun to have a day put together with Skip Vaccarello from the Silicon Valley area. So I just thought I'd share a little bit about his background so you can appreciate who you're about to hear. Skip Vaccarello has been a longtime veteran in the Silicon Valley area. He came first as for over 35 years, I should point out. He came first as a VP of Visicor, industry's first spreadsheet. And he played an integral role in the revolution in personal computing in the 1980s. He's been CEO of 3 other Silicon Valley companies and has been part of the growth in the networking and communications industry, as well as the explosion in the internet usage in the 1990s and 2000. Recently, he's also been involved in companies that connect with social networking. What makes Skip unique is his ability to speak not only the language of industry tech executives, but also to believers in the area. So over the last several years, he's developed a network of believers that have come together on a quarterly and annual basis around an event that he has helped form and structure, the Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast. The purpose of this event, and I've been there a couple of times and I can just attest to what an amazing opportunity it is not only to provide a venue for people of faith to gather together, but to bring along seekers, those who perhaps don't know God in a personal way. They can come and hear stories of faith that will inspire them to think a little bit more deeply about their own spiritual journey. So I know that Skip is excited to share some of those stories for you tonight, and rather than taking up more time, please join me in welcoming Skip Vaccarello.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's a privilege to be here, and I've really enjoyed. I've had a full day, and I've met some of you already, and it's just a wonderful university that you have here, and it's been a privilege for me to get a chance to meet some of your faculty, to meet your president, some of the administrators, and you have a gem of a university. So I've enjoyed very much enjoyed my day. So let me first ask a question. How many here are from the Bay Area? So a few of us, a few anyway. Well, what I plan to do tonight is there are 4 things that I'm planning to do. First, I'll give you a little bit of history of Silicon Valley for those that haven't been there yet or don't even know about it. So I'll give you a little bit of the history of Silicon Valley. Then I'm going to tell some stories about people in Silicon Valley and how they've come to faith. In the process, I'll tell you my story. Then I'll give you a faith perspective of what's going on in Silicon Valley, and finally I'll end with a challenge. And I should say one other thing. I noticed Joseph Bentz is here. Joseph had a very early version of this book. I was at a conference and he was the cohort leader, and I just really appreciate you have a terrific professor here in Dr. Bentz. So Silicon Valley, can you see that slide okay? So initially, see around Palo Alto, in the early 50s, or actually more the late 50s and 60s, Silicon Valley was considered just that area around Palo Alto. Palo Alto, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, that's what Silicon Valley was. But since then, it's really expanded. South of San Jose, east over past Fremont in that area, and north up to San Francisco. So it's really expanded. I loved what LinkedIn co-founder had said about it is LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman. What he said is Silicon Valley is really a state of mind, not a geography. It's a state of mind and not a geography. It really permeates the intellect of most people that live in this area. Some people come to Silicon Valley and say, okay, where is it? I can't find it. But it's more than that. It's really a state of mind. So this is a history of Silicon Valley. So it started out as being mostly agricultural. It's a very rural area. There were orchards everywhere. In fact, where I lived was all apricot orchards. So it's apricots, peaches, plums, those sort of things. It was absolutely beautiful when I've seen pictures of that. But then along came the semiconductor in the late 50s and 60s. Fairchild Camera, you might or might not have heard about the company. And through military contracts, primarily, the semiconductor was invented. And then from there, it was the personal computers, and that was really the development from the semiconductor to microchips. And this was the late 70s, early 80s that made the opportunity to have personal computers to produce thousands of transactions instantly. And that was when I came to Silicon Valley, was in late 1979. And so from personal computers then from there we see networking. There was a need to network these personal computers. And then after that, along came the internet, beginning in around the 1990s, which was more than being able to connect with computers around the world. And then social networking has followed that. And now it's what I'm seeing more and more is artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, I would expect for the next several years, we'll see technologies developing in and around algorithms for artificial intelligence. So I've left a lot of things out, but a brief history of Silicon Valley. And what's fascinating about the area is as we see technologies changing over the years, companies coming and going in the process. It's a wonderful place to live. Well, Silicon Valley is also the entrepreneurial capital of the world. There's more venture capital money invested in Silicon Valley companies than any other place in the world. Have you heard the term unicorn? Do you know what unicorn means? In investing parlance, a unicorn is a privately held company, that's worth over $1 billion. And in a survey I saw recently, there are 60 unicorns in Silicon Valley, 60 companies that are privately held, not traded on the public stock market, that are valued at $1 billion and more. It's also expensive place to live. Salaries are high, but it's an expensive place to live. The average house price is about $1 million, and I saw something in the Wall Street Journal the other day that described the San Francisco Bay Area is an area having some of the least discretionary income of any other area in the country. So salaries are high, but expenses are also high. The result of that is that there are many people that are living lives of struggle. It's hard to make ends meet. At the same time, there are people that are getting vastly rich. Young technology workers that happen to be working for the right company that's going public, and the stock continues to increase. Faith in Silicon Valley. How many people think about Silicon Valley as a place of God? At least not God as we know him, right? Now, Silicon Valley, there are some statistics that I've seen, some anecdotally people talk about. In Silicon Valley, on any given Sunday, there may be 4% of the people are in church. I've seen statistics that have indicated that there are 30% fewer people in church in Silicon Valley than on the average of the rest of the country. The George Barna Group defined what it means to be highly Christianized, and there are about 10 criteria: frequent Bible reading, church attendance, practicing the spiritual disciplines, and so on. And with that criteria that his group developed, Silicon Valley is 55% less Christianized than on the average in the rest of the country. Another survey I showed indicated that San Francisco, of the 19,000 over 300 cities in the country, San Francisco is rated third to the last in terms of spirituality, or people that are committed in their faith to one thing or another. So it's a highly secular area, but at the same time, I see some hope. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, where I see lives beginning to change and God at work in Silicon Valley. So I'll get to that a little bit later. So let me tell you my story. That's me, by the way. What are you laughing at? Those of you who are students, this was at my graduation at Harvard, and you see we're protesting something then, and it seemed like we're protesting. During my time at Harvard, it was a time of great turmoil. The late 60s and early 70s, you may recall from history, was one of the most turbulent times in our country's history. I would say in many ways even more divisive than it is today. So when I was at Harvard, there was a student strike. students took over the main administration building and marched out the dean of students and issued their demands. And there was a riot in Harvard Square. The National Guard had to be brought in. There were fires, there were windows broken. It was a very difficult and not the best time to be in school. Anyway, that was what was going on. During this period, the main issues were the war in Vietnam that many were against. There was the beginning of feminism. There were racial riots in 1968 in cities across the country. The sexual revolution had begun, and drugs were pervasive on college campuses. Sounds a little bit like maybe what's going on today. But that was that era. So many in my generation, which we'd call the baby boomers, walked away from traditional values, including faith, and I was one of those. I had been brought up attending a church, but walked away from that for about the next 20 years. Now, during those 20 years, I would have always said that I believed in God, and I probably would have called myself a Christian. But I wasn't studying the Bible, wasn't attending church, was hardly praying. Maybe if I get in trouble, I might pray to God for help, but wasn't doing much of that. One thing I forgot to mention, by the way, when I was at Harvard, with all that stuff that was going on the college campuses, the president at Harvard called my class, the class of 1971, Harvard's worst class ever. So here's somebody in front of you, a member of Harvard's worst class ever. And I can understand it with the building takeovers and everything else that was going on. In fact, my class has taken on that as our moniker. Whenever I go back to a reunion, the t-shirts are always Harvard's worst class ever. But anyway, from that point, my life was really about me pursuing my career, my success, hoping to find a great woman to marry, which I'm fortunate to say I did. We've now been married for almost 40 years. But that's what my life was about. Well, I moved to Silicon Valley in 1979 with a company that developed the very first spreadsheet called VisiCalc. Spreadsheets are sort of passé today, but it was the first application called a killer app that really made a personal computer useful. Now, I was not the founder of the company, but the first employee, and it was an exciting time to be in that industry. And so for the first time in my life, I began to achieve some financial success. Now, I came from a family that didn't have much money. My dad had never finished high school, certainly wasn't poor, but we never had any extra money. So the first time in my life, I began to make some money and began to have some success. But interestingly, I felt that there was something missing. I felt that there had to be more to life than success. Years later, I read what Blaise Pascal, the mathematician and the scientist, called a God-shaped void that's in each one of us. And I didn't know it, that's not what I called it. Pascal goes on to say that the only thing that can fill that void adequately is God. Now, many people, including me, try to fill it with success, with money, with all sorts of things, but God is the only thing that can fill that void. And I believe that there are many people, probably here in this area and in Silicon Valley, that are trying to live that sort of life today. But that's the life that I was leading. But that changed one day when I was on a business trip in Paris. And I called home to my wife, Jackie, and I said, "Jackie, what did you do for the weekend?" And what she said astounded me. It wasn't that our house burned down. It wasn't that our children were injured in any way. What she said very simply was, "I went to church." I said, "You did what?" She said, "I went to church." Church wasn't even part of our conversation. But we were going through some difficulty. Our second child had just been born with a genetic deficiency that required that we take blood from this little infant a couple of times a week. So the baby would cry, our older daughter would cry, my wife would cry. It would be a very upsetting time. Well, what had happened this one day is a woman followed my wife into the driveway, and Jackie calls her a crazy woman, followed her into the driveway and said, "Do you want to go to church?" And Jackie said, in a weak moment, I said yes. So she did. She went to church. There's a whole story behind that. A very brief part of that story is this woman had seen Jackie earlier. Jackie had taken our older daughter to a vacation Bible school because she needed time with our infant. And that this woman happened to see Jackie drive by, and she said, I only found out this recently, the Holy Spirit spoke to her, and she said, follow that woman and ask her to go to church. So this woman, Jane Washburn, jumped in her car, drove to our house, followed Jackie in and asked her to go to church. So Jackie went to church, and what she said is for the first time, she began to feel a sense of peace that she hadn't felt before. So when I came home, I kind of followed my wife to church. So much for male leadership. I followed her to church, and for me, I began to get a sense of meaning. I began to find out what was missing in my life. So that began me on a search for, is this stuff really true? Is this Christian faith really true? And I had a number of questions. These were some of the questions that I had in my mind. Some of them may have been questions that you might have had along the line. The first two that I put in bold were probably the most important. How do I know the Bible is true? Our faith is built on the Bible. How do I know that this book is really true? And the second one is, who is Jesus? People revere Jesus as a wonderful teacher, maybe a prophet, but is Jesus really the Son of God? So these are the questions that I had. So I began an investigation for the basis of Christian faith. I began to read the Bible for the first time, read Josh McDowell and C.S. Lewis. And I came to the conclusion that the Bible is true and Jesus is really who he says he is. Jesus is God. So I first came to faith intellectually. It made sense to me. But then it became emotional when I realized that I could have a relationship with the creator of the universe. And it became the central part of my life. This was in the mid-1980s. And there were two things that God put on my heart to do. One of them was to try to live out my faith day to day in my business. And the second was to help others know who Christ is. I really wanted others to know the joy, the meaning that I experienced. And so what I came to find after coming to faith over the next several years is purpose, mission, and a calling. Now, do you know, those of us that are here that are followers of Christ, do you know that we share the same purpose? We share the same purpose. Has anyone read Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life? If you have Rick Warren, and the very first sentence of that book, I don't know if you recall this, the very first sentence in the book is, it's not about you. It's not about you. Isn't our culture, that's not what the message is that we hear, is it? Isn't everything about us? But Rick Warren said it's not about you. And to sum up what he says in that book is, he said our purpose is to honor God and glorify God in everything that we do. So those of us that are here today who are followers of Christ, we all share that same purpose. And that purpose, I believe, is described by what Jesus called the Great Commandment. To love God with our whole heart, soul, and mind, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So that's our purpose. What about our mission? Those of us that are here, that are followers of Christ, we also share the same mission. Our mission is defined by the Great Commission, which is to help others know who Christ is, to go make disciples of all nations. So that's what our mission is here on the earth. And I began to discover that for myself. Now, each one of us have a different calling. In fact, we can have multiple callings, I believe, at the same time. And that calling can change over time. My calling, I felt the calling to go into business. I also felt a calling to raise my family, as followers of Christ, to be the best father I could, to be the best husband I could. And more recently, my calling has been, to write this book, Finding God in Silicon Valley, which was an outgrowth of my desire to help people know who Christ is. I wrote that book with the purpose of the hope that people who are not yet followers of Christ would read stories about leaders in Silicon Valley and say, maybe I should consider faith. Maybe I should consider faith. So we all have a different calling, and in living out that calling, it's our role as followers of Christ to live out our purpose and our mission as we follow that calling. So I'm going to tell you some stories now about some leaders in Silicon Valley and how they've found their calling. So my first story is about Pat Gelsinger. Now, Pat Gelsinger is CEO of VMware. VMware is a $6 billion company with 20,000 employees. Now, Pat Gelsinger is very open about talking about his faith. I've had him speak at a couple of the events that I've sponsored. He and I were on a video that was on PBS. And what's amazing is Pat Gelsinger calls his company, this company of 20,000 employees, he calls VMware his church. And he calls himself the pastor of VMware. Now, isn't that an amazing statement for the CEO of a publicly held company? He views his work as his ministry, as we all should, no matter what work we do. Well, Pat had an interesting way, I think, of coming to faith. He grew up a Christian. But in his words, he felt that he was never truly a follower of Christ. He was convicted by one day when he was in church. This was when he was living in Silicon Valley, and the pastor preached from Revelation 3:15 through 16. I know your deeds, they are neither hot nor cold. I wish they were one or the other. But since you are lukewarm, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. When Pat Gelsinger heard that, he knew that he was lukewarm. He was not all out for Christ. So Pat Gelsinger's first instinct was to become a vocational minister. He said, if I want to truly be hot for God, to live out for God, I want to be a vocational minister. But he also felt convicted because he felt called to business. And then he came across Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not for men. And he realized that his ministry could be his business. So Scripture is what convinced Pat Gelsinger both to come to faith, to be a follower of Christ, and to find his calling. So that's Pat Gelsinger. Paul Ely. Paul Ely is he's sometimes called the person that helped make Hewlett-Packard into a computer company. Paul Ely was an engineer by training, and he started working for Hewlett-Packard when they were a test and measurement company. But in the early 1970s, they had developed their very first computer. It was called the HP 3000. When the HP 3000 was introduced, it wasn't working properly. There were customer complaints it just wasn't working. And that was contrary to the values that Hewlett and Packard wanted as part of their company. So Paul Ely had been very successful in the test and measurement division. He was asked to take over the computer division, and he did turn it around and help make Hewlett-Packard into a computer company. Now, Paul Ely had an interesting style of management. It's characterized by the phrase, ready, fire, aim. Ready, fire, aim. And that's actually a pretty appropriate strategy for many things in life, including a technology business. You get ready, you take a shot at something, you might miss, you aim again, and you take another shot at it. That was his management philosophy. And Paul Ely was kind of a no-nonsense guy. Well, Paul Ely was very successful. He became a board member at Hewlett-Packard, left Hewlett-Packard to have a successful career after that. But Paul Ely was not a follower of Christ. He attended church as a youngster but walked away from it. Paul Ely's whole life was about business and success. Well, one day, at the age of 76, Paul Ely had a dream. And in his dream, he said his whole life went before him like a YouTube video. And what he realized was that all his success that he's had in graduate school, in business, that it was God that was behind all that. And at the end of that dream, he heard a message, Paul, you must find who I am. You must find God. So Paul Ely began a quest to find out who God was. He started reading the Bible, found a Bible study, and after a few months of that investigation, Paul Ely committed his life to Christ. This was at the age of 76. So Paul Ely realized that God had given him a calling in business, even though he wasn't a follower of Christ, but now gave him a new calling. And his new calling was to help others know who Christ is. And he began volunteering at an organization called Global Media that has a web-based application to help introduce people to Christ. So Paul Ely began to find his calling through a dream. Jada Im. Jada Im was born in South Korea in a Buddhist family. She came to the United States, living here in Southern California. Some friends had invited her to church, and she became a follower of Christ as a teenager. But Jada says that her profession was really much more important to her than her faith. She was a pharmacist by trade. Well, Jada was also sickly. She began to experience some headaches that required that she take time off from work. Her headaches became more severe. She had migraine headaches that required that you leave work altogether. So if you think of this, if you think of someone whose stronghold in life is their work, when that's taken away, what do they do about it? She says she began to pray and nothing happened. She said she was on the verge of suicide. Her stronghold had been taken away. God didn't seem to be present. A friend came into her life called Janelle. Janelle began investing time, praying with Jada, and one day suggested that Jada go to a healing service at her church, Jubilee Christian Center in San Jose. Jada hadn't ventured from her house very much, but Janelle had become a good friend, so she did that. And she felt a connection with the pastor that preached that day. After the service was over, Janelle knew the pastor and went in the back, and that pastor put his hands on Jada and prayed for her. Prayed for healing for Jada. And what she says is that she felt nothing at the time. But when she went home, she said this, she said, if I'm healed, I'm going to completely give my life to Christ. She said the next 3 days, her body just purged itself. Her family thought she should be rushed to the hospital. She said, no, I think I have to go through this. And she emerged after that third day, and she was completely healed. Didn't have any more migraine headaches. And she said, God, I'll do whatever you want me to do. Jada Im had experienced a miracle. She began to search for things. She felt inclined to help women in need. And one day she happened to be at a lecture and said there was a problem in the area of the police rescuing women from human trafficking but didn't know what to do with them. Jada says immediately she had this sense that that was what her calling was, to help those women who were rescued from human trafficking. She went home and told her husband, Carl, she said, Carl, this is what we want to do. I want to buy a house to help these women. I think her husband, Carl, was a saint. After some hesitation, he agreed, okay, we're going to buy a house for these women. So that's what they did. They bought a house. They opened a ministry called Freedom House. And Freedom House, over the last several years, has helped hundreds of women who have been rescued from human trafficking. So Jada Im found her calling through the miracle that she had experienced, and her friend Janelle, who took the time to reach out to Jada, not only changed Jada's life, but the lives of hundreds of other women. So God works in interesting ways to help us come to faith and find our calling. Is there a spiritual awakening in Silicon Valley? I kind of alluded to this earlier. I have a friend who I've quoted in the book, and what he likes to say is, he sees thousands of points of light in Silicon Valley rather than one big blaze. And I agree with him. There are thousands of points of light in Silicon Valley. Is there an awakening? I think it's possible that there's an awakening. Let me give you some of what I've found as I've lived in Silicon Valley for a while, where I think that God is at work. First, is there executives who are willing to talk about their faith. I've already told you about Paul Ely. I've told you about Pat Gelsinger. Kirk Perry. Kirk Perry is one of the top executives at Google. And Google is a company that's not necessarily known for their Christian faith or even supportive of Christian faith. Kirk Perry was in line. He'd worked at Procter & Gamble in Ohio, was in line potentially to be the next president. Well, Kirk Perry was what he would call himself a nominal Christian. But then his young daughter was diagnosed with cancer. And that drove Kirk Perry to his knees. And he finally realized what God must have gone through when he saw the suffering that Jesus went through. And he was realizing that in the life of his daughter. So Kirk Perry became a committed follower of Christ at that point. And he and his wife loved Cincinnati. They loved Procter & Gamble, but he felt a different call. Kirk Perry felt the call to come to Silicon Valley, and he did. He's an executive at Google. And Kirk Perry, we've had him at our Silicon Valley prayer breakfast. He's been open talking about his faith. And interestingly, maybe that's not the right word, Kirk Perry contracted cancer himself. This was when he was less than 50 years old. Kirk Perry did something that happens rarely in Silicon Valley, and it was stage 4 cancer. He asked the people in Google to pray for him. It sounds maybe simple to us, but that's a big deal, to ask people in Google to pray for him. He says the result of that is he had many conversations about faith with those people. So Kirk Perry is one that shares his faith. Deb Liu. Deb Liu is a senior executive at Facebook. What Deb Liu likes to say is she believes her job at Facebook is to honor God in everything that she does, and she says she now has the opportunity to help influence the lives of billions of people by the work she does. She takes her job seriously. And she's open about talking about her Christian faith. Now, she does two things, I find. Again, Facebook is not one of these companies that's particularly friendly to Christian faith. But she does two things. You can't see it in this picture, but she often wears the cross as a piece of jewelry. The other thing she does is she writes openly on her own personal Facebook account about her Christian faith. Now, when you think about that, if you work for Deb Liu, you're probably going to look at her personal Facebook page, right? So she's not at work passing out tracts or doing anything like that. But they probably look and they realize that Deb Liu is a follower of Christ. So she identifies as a follower of Christ. She's an example of an employee that works really hard at what she does. Pramod Haq. Pramod Haq is one of the top venture capitalists in the world. Forbes magazine often does a study of the top venture capitalists. One year he was identified as the top venture capitalist in the world. Invested billions of dollars in company, made billions of dollars in value. When Pramod Haq came to faith, he's from India. He, like Pat Gelsinger, thought that he should be a minister. He tried it for a while. He said, I found I was not very good at it. And he found his calling was business. And Pramod Haq is very open talking about his faith. So one of the examples of what I see happening in Silicon Valley are executives that are willing to talk about their faith. Another thing that I found is, and this is one of the most surprising things to me, entrepreneurs who are building their businesses to glorify God. I didn't expect to find that. I just have two examples up there. Neil Alston. Neil was a guy who was very successful, brilliant guy. He's graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley, has a master's degree from Princeton, a good job at Google. But one day, he had been thinking about applying technology to faith. And one day when he was in church, he heard a message from God that suggested that he'd do exactly that. He left a good job to start a company called Carpenter's Code that has an app called Abide. Does anyone here use Abide by any chance? If you don't, you ought to look at downloading it. Abide has millions of users. It's a prayer app and meditation app. So he left a lucrative position to find a for-profit company. It's a for-profit company. It's not a non-profit company that has built this prayer app called Abide. Victor Ho. Victor Ho was working at McKinsey, probably one of the top consulting companies in the United States. He was working in New York City. Was thinking about shifting his career, came out to San Francisco to apply to private equity firms. He said, this would be nice. I've been working at McKinsey. If I get a job at a private equity firm, it would look great on my resume. But he had also been thinking about starting a business. So after interviewing the private equity companies, he was sitting at SFO, and he said he was sitting there, he heard a clear message from God. The message from God was, Victor, why are you being such a coward about this? You know what you should do. Victor called up the private equity company, said, I'm not going to work for you. I'm going to do something else. And he started this company called 5 Stars, which is a loyalty card. Victor would describe the purpose of his business was to change the transactional nature of commerce. Now, 5 Stars is very successful. They have, last I saw, about 300 employees. They're located in San Francisco. But, even when we're following our calling, God doesn't guarantee our success. And Victor said something very interesting, I thought. And this is what he said. He said, even if we go down in flames, I want to make sure that we're lights in the world. He was quoting from Matthew. You want to be light, even if we go down in flames. What he was saying is, even if we fail, I still want to be a light of the world. That's the way we should think about integrating our faith in our work, whether it's through success or otherwise. So entrepreneurs who are building their businesses to glorify Christ, and I can have many, many other examples of that. In Silicon Valley, we have some of the leading pastors in the country. I count about 12 to 15 churches that have 1,500 or more people that are attending them. Some of the top pastors, you probably know of Francis Chan, John Ortberg, Chip Ingram. They all have churches in Silicon Valley, and there are several others. So there are some great churches. There are churches that are expanding. Many are going to multiple campuses. Or Francis Chan has a house church movement going in San Francisco. A church that started, I mentioned that to one of these groups today, and I know that there is one in Southern California called Reality Church. Dave Lomas started Reality in San Francisco. And when I interviewed Dave Lomas, he said this. He said when he was talking to his pastor friends in San Francisco, one of them said that he had, in 17 years of ministry, he's never seen such a movement of God in San Francisco. You think of San Francisco as being a pretty secular place. So some of the top nonprofits, I've mentioned, there are several, but there are some top nonprofits run by Christian social entrepreneurs. And Jennifer had mentioned the San Francisco Silicon Valley Prayer Breakfast. I chair the event. We run it as an outreach. And every year it sells out. We have about 900 people come to our annual event. This is in Silicon Valley. It always amazes me that people get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, to go to an event called the Prayer Breakfast. And what they do is, we run this as an outreach. We challenge believers to invite their friends who are not yet followers of Christ. They come because they want to hear a Kirk Perry or a Pat Gelsinger, or one of these people, these top executives. And what they're going to hear is how God's working in the lives of those executives. Our whole purpose of these events is simply to open up conversations about faith. But that's just another example of that. And there are churches being planted. There's an organization called Transforming the Bay with Christ. John Ortberg's wife, Nancy Ortberg, is the CEO. Pat Gelsinger started this, I think it was about 5 years ago, to make a difference in the Bay Area. I think Tim Keller has once said if an area has 10% of the people are fully committed followers of Christ, you can expect that there is going to be a revival in that area. And that's what TBC is trying to do, come alongside what God is doing. So they have three purposes. One is to unify the church, so the pastors, the people get to know each other. The second thing is to help facilitate providing outstanding service. It's unfortunate that many people know us not by what we're for as followers of Christ, but what we're against. The way we counteract that is just with love. If we love people, if we really care for people, if we really provide outstanding service, we can change that way that they think of us people think of us as followers of Christ. And the third thing is to help start the planting of new churches. And there are many new churches that I see beginning. So that's transforming the Bay with Christ. So it's all well and good. I see the beginning, what could be the beginning of a movement of God in Silicon Valley. But the question I have is what about you? What does this mean? What does this mean for you? Whenever I speak to an audience, even an audience here at a Christian university or at a church, I never assume that everyone in the audience is a follower of Christ. So if that's you, if you're not, I urge you to take the next step on your spiritual journey. Faith is a decision that we all make. We're given free will by God. So I'd urge you to take that next step, whatever it might be. Talk to your friends, read the Bible, take that next step of faith. If you are a follower of Christ, I urge you to truly look at your purpose. Are you glorifying God in everything that you do? I know many of you are going to be going off to work in various places. It could be as nurses, it could be as in business. Some of you will go off to vocational ministry. But truly try to live out your purpose, the purpose that God's given you to glorify Him in everything that you do. To help follow the mission that God's given us. The mission to help other people know who Christ is. And a verse that I've found that's very important to me in doing that is 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks the reason for the hope you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And I think the gentleness and respect is an important part of that conversation. I don't think we're going to reach a lot of people by confronting them. Sometimes we need to confront people by yelling at them, trying to persuade them, trying to convince them. But if we can answer people's questions with gentleness and respect, we can make a difference. And as you find your calling, just truly try to live out your purpose and your mission. Well, that's the opportunity that we all have, is to come along what God is doing. Now, it's not up to us whether people come to faith or not. It's not up to us, it's up to God. Our role is simply to be obedient, to obey what God would have any one of us do. Well, let me end. I think we're probably getting close to 8 o'clock. Yep, just about. Let me end with just one final story. So this was a number of years ago. I hired a man. I was the vice president of operations at this company that had the first spreadsheet, VisiCalc. I hired a man. His name was Dick. And Dick and I had very different personalities. I hired him to run our facilities. Dick was one of these. He was a war veteran, a no-nonsense kind of guy. He ruffled lots of feathers. I tended to be much more diplomatic. I would often have to smooth things over as he'd rough things up a little bit. But we worked well together as a team. Well, as we both eventually left that company, I would always hire Dick, and I became a follower of Christ. And when I did, I began to want to meet personally with Dick, ask him what his story is, ask him about his faith, and I shared my story. And what I came to find out is Dick would say he believed in God, but didn't really need church, didn't think that Christ was the only way. So we had a number of conversations, but not ready to commit to faith. But one day I had a call from him And he said I was one of the first to call and let me know that he had just been diagnosed with cancer. And he and I began to meet more frequently. And our conversation shifted to more about faith, but Dick still wasn't ready to commit to Christ. Now he took a turn. At first he got better, then he took a turn for the worse, to the point it looked like he was really days away from death. So when I went into the hospital, I asked Dick point blank, I said, Dick, we've had many conversations about faith. Are you now willing to accept Christ as your Savior? And his response was, yes, I think I am. And this was a man, very strong, manly man. He had shriveled up to almost nothing. What that told me was that Dick was ready to make that commitment, but still had some doubts. But he was willing to take that step of faith. So as I held his hand, I prayed with him to accept Christ. And after I did, I said, Dick, there's now a celebration in heaven. I read from him the parable of the lost coin and the lost sheep, where there's a celebration for anyone who was lost has now been saved and found. So Dick had a smile on his face. Well, 2 days later, he passed away. And his wife, who had a conversation between when Dick prayed to accept Christ and when he died, she realized what his commitment was, and she asked if I would do the memorial service for him, the eulogy for him, which I did. Now, I tell you this story not because it's about me, but as the opportunities that we all have. If we truly follow our calling, follow our purpose, follow our mission, we have opportunities to reach out to people. And I think that all of us don't know, who we've affected along the way. The way we've conducted our lives, we can have an effect on everyone that we meet. So I'll just conclude with this. I don't know if there's going to be a revival in Silicon Valley or not. I view my job and the job of fellow believers as simply to try to obey the call of God, to reach out to people, to try to live our lives in such a way that people will be attracted to Christ. But if you think of that, you think of Silicon Valley as probably being the technological capital of the world. You think of New York City, where there seems to begin the beginning of a revival through some of the work that Tim Keller and others have done. New York City is the financial capital of the world. I look at this area, the Los Angeles area. You have some great churches here. I think there are many points of light here. The LA area is the entertainment capital of the world. Can you imagine for a moment if New York City, Silicon Valley, and the Los Angeles area, the financial, the technological, and the entertainment capital of the world, ever became known as a place of God? Can you just imagine that for a moment? If that ever happens, the world would take notice. We all can play a part of that. We can play a part in God's story. You may say, well, that seems impossible. But that quote from Matthew 19:26, with God, all things are possible. Thank you very much.